1960s were a time of worldwide student activism. In Germany, students demanded more control at their universities. In France, student activism almost toppled the government of Charles de Gaulle. American college students used civil disobedience tactics to campaign against racial discrimination and to protest the war in Vietnam. The student demonstrations focused widespread public opposition to the war.
The free speech movement started as a nonviolent student protest in 1964 on the campus of the University of California in Berkeley. Students pushed that the university administration allow on-campus political activities and recognize the students' right to free speech and academic freedom.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Hey, wait a second. What's the meaning for this? Why was any of this happening in the first place?
Keep a knocking, but you can't come in. Keep a knocking, but you can't come in. Keep a knocking, but you can't come in. Come back tomorrow night and try it again. You said you love me, but you can't come in. You said you love me, but you can't come in. Whoa! You said you love me, but you can't come in. Come back tomorrow night and try it again.
On Friday, May 13, 1960, the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities hosted a private meeting in San Francisco City Hall on the investigation of communist infiltration of unions, the film industry, and the teaching profession. Protesters and college students disrupted the meeting while they sang and hollered outside the chambers. Then, without warning, the police turned on the fire hoses and washed the protesters down the marble staircases. 64 were arrested and hauled off, but later they were all released and free from all charges.
It was the first major mass student demonstration in decades. It led directly to the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964, said Irving Hall, who was a 24-year-old UC Berkeley teaching assistant who had come across the Bay for the protest. It made possible the 1960s in all its variations.
Good morning, this is Anne-Marie from BBC London. We have breaking news from France. The National Student Union has supported the independence of Algeria, which has caused a split between the Union and the de Gaulle regime. Hear what de Gaulle has to say about this tragic event.
Et pourrait même provoquer la guerre civile. Tout au long de ce mois de mai 1968, j'ai été témoin de la protestation des étudiants des universités de plusieurs révoltes contre mes campagnes politicales. Je crains que les étudiants qui se révoltent dans mon pays provoquent d'importantes destructions dans nos systèmes politiques et économiques, et pourraient même provoquer la guerre civile.
In addition, discontent has sparked amongst the students in Sorbonne, France, because of the breakdown at the college during enrollment. After a day of riots and strikes between 4,500 police and 10,000 students, 300,000 students in 23 universities in France have gone on strike. Good afternoon, this is Anne-Marie from BBC London. Protests have broken out at the London School of Economics because of political problems we have been facing in Rhodesia. The British student movement has begun as a protest against the government's control of the marketing of college education, including the tripling of tuition fees.
During the Easter weekends of 1958 through 1960, anti-war protests organized by the British Anti-War Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament were performed starting at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston in Berkshire and ended in London, a distance of over 52 miles. These protesters in Britain demanded that the war in Vietnam be put to an end immediately and would fight until they saw the day fulfilled. The Beatles impacted the students in Britain with their new style of music. People tended to blame the students' activism on the influence from the Beatles. Let's hear what the Beatles have to say about all this nonsense.
We all want to change the world.
Oh! Well, hello there! Hello! We are the Beatles. This is John Lennon and I'm Paul McCartney. A lot of folk have been saying lately that our music impacts students worldwide negatively. Well, that's a crop of brass monkeys. We love the people, and we want what the people want. Peace, love, and drugs. Moving on to our next news report. In Italy, protests have been centered around the University of Turin. The students have been fighting for student governance, curriculum reforms, and the relevance of education to real life. Good morning, this is Anne-Marie from BBC UK. We have a special guest this morning, Mr. Mike Smith, who is from New York City and is a specialist on the student rebellion outbreak that has caused the world trouble for months now. Good morning, Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon, Anne.
You know, I heard that this specific protest in Germany came because the Shah of Iran was actually coming to Germany and the students were angry?
This is correct. Actually, the students were revolting and the police came and just massacred these students. It was one of the most bloodiest, horrific events that we have seen in Europe.
Wow. And I heard about the execution of one particular student.
Yes, his name is unknown, but we do know that over 200,000 students attended his funeral, which is quite spectacular.
Wow, that's very nice. And this was in Hanover, correct?
This is correct.
And I heard about the police in Hanover.
The police and government actually have united and joined forces to take out all the students who are rebelling against their system.
Wow, that is crazy. Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Good night. This is Anne-Marie from BBC UK. It is quite chilly outside, especially in Czechoslovakia, where Alexander Dubček has replaced an unpopular leader. And he has introduced himself as a person with a completely new democracy. He has been trying to persuade the students to love him. The students have given into that a little bit, but they have still started a few protests. They had a very important role in the Prague Spring of Discussion last week, and they made it clear that they would like these reforms to continue. After a few protests, the students were actually successful so far.
In Czechoslovakia, the repressive regime of Antonin Novotny still stamped on demands for a more open society. By February 1968, the Czechoslovak reformers were taking over. Brezhnev flew to Prague to size up the new leader, Alexander Dubček. Brezhnev accepted that some change was inevitable.
People try to put us to down, talking about my generation, just because we get around, talking about my generation, things they do look awful, talking about my generation, I hope I die before I get old.
In Poland, the students there have been motivated by the success of the protests in Czechoslovakia and decided to reform the government.
At the end of the 1960s, the student rebellion was labeled a generational issue and was practically swept under the rug. However, if you ask any previous activists that were involved in the chaos, you can count on them saying, what happened in the 60s stays in the 60s.